welcome back. You're watching World Talks and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. After what seemed like a very pleasant call between the President of the United States and EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen on Sunday, Donald Trump has agreed to delay 50% tariff measures on European goods. The news was welcomed with a certain dose of relief, but the postponement does not mean that the transatlantic trade war is over. To decode the meaning of this delay, I'm joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University College Dublin. Mr. Lucas, thank you for joining on the program again.
Thank you.
So President von der Leyen has secured a temporary, let's stress that, temporary delay on the proposed U.S. tariffs. Do you believe that this extension to July 9th gives the EU enough time to negotiate a fair deal with Washington, or is it merely delaying the inevitable?
Well, I can't tell you that because the situation changes day to day, depending upon Donald Trump's mood and depending upon who he's been talking to. Allow me to explain. Your viewers will remember that these tariffs date back to April the 2nd, when Donald Trump announced Liberation Day and tariffs on every country in the world, including the Herd Islands, which has no people, only penguins. Those tariffs ranged from 10% to 50%. In the case of the EU, they started off at 39%. Now, a week later, when some officials went to Donald Trump and said, look, these are really damaging. These are going to hurt Americans first and foremost. This is hurting the bond market. It's hurting the stock market. Trump backed away and lowered the tariffs. He lowered them to 20% on the EU. And then he said, well, maybe we'll reduce this down to 10% while we have a 90-day pause, all the way till July the 9th. But a few days ago, either because Trump was in a bad mood again, because he tends to act like a bully, or because certain officials who favor high tariffs, especially a man named Peter Navarro, went in and told him, the Europeans are not treating you well. Then he said 50% tariffs. And of course, what happens is only 2 days later, the other officials who say, no, we need to have a more sensible approach to tariffs. You need to pull this back. They tell him to speak to Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president. She says good things to him. We want a deal. We want 0 for 0 tariffs. And then he backs down. This is like the swing of a pendulum, that one day Trump wants to act like the bully. He wants to punch somebody in the nose, and then on another day, he retreats and says, well, maybe I need to think about what I'm doing.
So for how long do you think the global economy, because we're not only talking about the U.S. or European economy, but the global economy as a whole is actually going to be able to withstand that pendulum swinging from one side to the other? I mean, there has to be some sort of a pivotal point at one moment or the other.
Well, the global economy continues to run despite the Trump administration. For example, Poland and other countries in the EU don't just trade with the United States.
Obviously, yes.
So while there are shocks from the tariffs, this is not going to crash the economy, but it is going to contract it. I mean, estimates were that if Trump implemented all of his high tariffs, including 145% tariffs on China, the GDP around the world to decrease by about up to 7%, and that's significant. But the way this happens is it's more of a corrosive effect. So what you see it is that prices gradually begin to rise, bond markets become more uncertain, and supply chains begin to get compromised. So we sort of feel this, it's almost like pain by 1,000 cuts rather than one sudden crash. Now, that said, if Trump continues the tariffs, some countries, including the United States, are likely to go into recession. And I would say that the even more serious issue beyond the tariffs is the U.S. government debt. The U.S. government debt is now $36 trillion. The budget proposal by the Trump administration, now being considered by Congress, would increase that debt by another $4 trillion. Now, how does that interact with the tariffs? Because of the tariffs, people are losing faith in U.S. bonds. They're buying less of them. And if people lose faith in U.S. bonds, how does the U.S. government finance its debt? That will be when the real crunch comes. If the U.S. can't pay off its debts because the dollar is the world's reserve currency.
I would like to pull back to Europe. Some in Brussels actually say that Washington's approach has been heavy-handed, demanding unilateral concessions from the EU. Do you think that the EU should stand firm, or is compromise the only way to avoid a damaging trade war?
I mean, it's not for me to advise the EU. There's lots of people who are doing that.
I'm just asking your opinion.
But I can. Yeah, I think it's helpful for me to assess what the EU has done, and then we can talk about whether this is what the EU has done since April 2nd, when you had Trump's Liberation Day, is to do two things. One is do not institute retaliatory tariffs immediately, because if you institute retaliatory tariffs, 10%, 20%, the first people who get hurt are going to be people in Europe, because consumers are going to pay higher prices for American products. Farmers are going to pay higher prices for some inputs. European manufacturers are going to pay higher prices for some components, some parts. So the EU has said, look, we are planning on tariffs if we can't get this settled, but in the meantime, let's talk. And what they have been talking to the Americans about, let's call them the adults in the room in the Trump administration, is on both goods and services, get to a 0 for 0 tariff situation. No tariffs whatsoever, while at the same time realizing that you have to maintain health and safety standards, which the Americans are trying to get the Europeans to get rid of. So it's a very pragmatic approach, which says don't escalate immediately. But if Donald Trump and let's call them the warrior protectionist insist on a tariff war, then at some point Europe will have to respond. And that point of response at this point, if Trump doesn't suddenly raise tariffs to 50, 60%, that point of response will come in July.
This is definitely something that we all do not wish to happen, especially now in light of the conflict that goes on, because it's the alliance that's going to suffer if the trade war goes on. So I know we do not have a crystal ball, at least I don't happen to have one, but what happens after June 9th? What are the possible scenarios as to what's going to happen? Because this is a very limited amount of time to be making some decisions when it comes to such a difficult and such a broad topic.
So with this July 9th deadline that's been set, it comes down to who prevails within the Trump administration, not just Donald Trump. And let me do that with a comparison with the ongoing question of will the U.S. support European and Ukrainian security? We know that there's one faction within the Trump administration that really doesn't believe in Europe's security or Ukraine's security. At times, that's included the Vice President, J.D. Vance. At times, that has included Donald Trump's envoy to Russia, Steve Witkoff. But there are others within the Trump administration, such as the envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. And I think to an extent, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who say, no, we can't just walk away from Europe completely. We can't just side with Russia. In the same way, you have people who are split on tariffs and the way that they affect Europe. You have some who are these warrior protectionists who want to break up the EU. That includes Peter Navarro, this very, very damaging influence in the White House. And I think it includes the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer. But you have others, such as the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who I think may be the most important official after Donald Trump now in the administration. And they're saying, no, U.S. depends on a good trade relationship with Europe. It depends on manufacturing. It depends on trading services. It depends on trade in high tech. So you can't just walk away from Europe. As long as Bessent and the others are there, we have hope that we get to a sensible arrangement on tariffs. I don't think the tariffs will go completely, but I think you may be talking about a 10% tariff. But if Scott Bessent was ever fired by Donald Trump, or heaven forbid, drop dead tomorrow, then those who really want to break up Europe would have the upper hand. And that's when you would have serious trouble.
Well, let's hope that does not happen. Let's hope Mr. Bessent is going to be just fine. Thank you so much for joining. Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University College Dublin, was my guest. Great to have you on the show back again.
Thanks to you and your viewers.
And so this would be all for now here on World Talks, but please do stay tuned back in just a moment, just as before, with more news and features. And I'll see you there.